This is Susan on the right-hand side. She's chair of one of our neighborhood associations, the Westwood Neighborhood Association. And she wanted to create a more inclusive organization. So she worked with our Department of Social and Health Services. And she said, could you send letters out to all your clients? And the letter basically said, hi, I'm Susan. I'm chair of the Neighborhood Association. Would love to get you involved. If you're interested, give me a call. So she got a call. She got a call from Raymond and Ginger. She went over to their house. They said, we've been living here 20 years. We don't know any of our neighbors. She looked around the walls of that house, and there were all these crafts on the walls. And a lot of the crafts had clown themes in them. She said, what's with these crafts and the clowns? They said, well, that's how we spend all our time. We make crafts. And Ginger said, Raymond used to be Rayto the clown, but he hasn't clowned in 20 years. Susan says, we've got our Delridge Community Festival happening this Saturday. Could you come down and clown for us? He was overjoyed. He and Ginger dug through their old boxes and finally found his clown outfit. Susan came, picked him up Saturday morning, drove him to the festival, and Rayto the clown was the hit of the festival. And they started inviting him to other community events, to kids' birthday parties. And in the process, he and Ginger met other people who did craft work. And they started driving them to craft shows. It's a way for them to make some income, to make other friendships. And Susan said that Raymond and Ginger opened doors for her in that neighborhood like nobody else had been able to. And the final story here is with Larry. Larry, as you can see, has a disability that makes him totally dependent on public transit. So Larry knows all the places the bus goes. Larry knows all the places the bus should go, but doesn't go. Larry knows all the places where there should be better security lighting at the bus stops, where there should be covered bus shelters. So when the neighborhood did their neighborhood plan, they tapped Larry to help with the transportation element. And Larry led a walking tour of the business district, and he pointed out all the access problems, because they weren't just a problem for Larry, they were a problem for elders with their walkers, for parents with their strollers. Larry was so highly valued that he was elected vice chair of the Capitol Hill Community Council. Somebody with developmental disabilities who'd been seen as somebody with nothing but needs is now a leader in his community because they lifted that label off. Second program we put in place is a program we call the Neighborhood Matching Fund. And the idea behind this program was a way to meet the community halfway on projects that had been a priority for the community, but had not been a priority for City Hall. So we said, so I asked our city council, I said, could I have $150,000 to pilot this program? And I said, I'd like the money so that we could meet neighborhoods halfway. We'll provide a cash match from the city in exchange for the community's equal match of volunteer labor or donated goods and services. Any group of neighbors is eligible to apply. You don't have to be an incorporated group. You don't have to have nonprofit status. Just any group of neighbors that wants to do a project. We're only going to fund one-time projects because we want to build capacity. We don't want to create dependence. So we aren't going to pay for staff. We aren't going to pay for operating costs. And all the funding decisions will be made by the neighborhood leaders themselves. Well, as you can maybe imagine, this was a pretty controversial idea when I presented it because our council members said, there's not enough money for everything that is our priority. Why should we put money into things that are not? But finally, on a vote of 5-4, they approved the program for that first year. That first year, we supported 22 community self-help projects with that money. They were so popular that the next year, our council voted unanimously to increase the fund to $1.5 million. They subsequently increased it to $4.5 million on another unanimous vote. So that now we support about 400 community self-help projects every year. We celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Matching Fund 2 years ago. There have now been more than 4,000 projects completed across the city of Seattle in every neighborhood, greatly changing the character of the place and increasing the livability of the place. The city's $50 million investment over the years has leveraged $70 million in community resources that under the old model, where people looking to government to do everything, never would have been tapped. But the best benefit is it's newly involved tens of thousands of people in community life because we've finally given people a way to get involved other than going to meetings. And I'm sure people are very different here, but in Seattle, a lot of people don't have time for meetings. So here's some of what resulted. This is in our Ballard neighborhood. Ballard was the neighborhood with the least number of street trees of any neighborhood in Seattle. And there was a woman there named Dervilla Gowan who cared passionately about street trees. She wanted to see trees up and down her streets. So she put notices in the Ballard News Tribune, the local paper. She put them in the church bulletin. She put them in the corner grocery store, advertising for other people. And she tried to find somebody in every block in Ballard. And if she couldn't find somebody who shared her passion, she would go to that block and knock on every door until she convinced somebody that they shared her passion for street trees. And then she got that person to sign a pledge form, saying, I'll come to a training about how to plant and take care of the trees, and I'll recruit my neighbors to do the same thing. So she turned in all of her pledge forms with her matching fund application. And one day, trucks pulled into her neighborhood with 1,080 trees. They dropped them off at every block in Ballard. Dervilla went and knocked on the door of the block captain, said the trees are here. Block captain knocked on the neighbor's doors. That day over 1,000 people came out and planted trees up and down the streets. People felt incredibly empowered. At the beginning of the day, there's no street trees. At the end of the day, they had tree-lined streets. Well, they said, this is cool, but we still have the fewest number of parks of any neighborhood in Seattle. So they walked around the neighborhood looking for potential park sites. Had a hard time finding them because the neighborhood is pretty built out. But finally they found this old rundown house. It used to be a nursery. Problem property, lots of drug dealing going on, lots of public safety problems. Right next to the business district. And they convinced our city council to buy that property. And the city had some money, open space bond money, to buy that property, but no money to design or build the park. So the neighbors did it themselves. Local landscape architect volunteered their services and worked with the other neighbors, and together they designed and built Baker Park. This is the entryway into the park. There's some beautiful old trees, and one of them had died. And they're trying to figure out how to remove it, and then one of the neighbors who was Native American had a better idea and carved it in place as a totem. And here's some of the detail. Bear with a frog in his mouth, kind of a symbol of returning nature to the city. Well, this group went on and built more parks. The next year they built a community garden. This is now one of 85 organic community gardens we have in Seattle, all built by volunteers in the community. And this is their most recent park. This is the site of a former house. So to commemorate the house, they built all the furniture out of cement. And at the dedication of this project, they unveiled a timeline that shows the 20 parks they built over the past 20 years. Every one of them with volunteers. They've restored a salmon estuary. They built ball fields. They built playgrounds. They worked with the kids to build a skate park. Well, then they said, you know, we made our neighborhood a much better environment, but we're concerned about what's happening to the planet. We're concerned about climate change. So they formed an all-volunteer group called Sustainable Ballard. And the big thing they do each year, they just had their 6th in a row, is do a Sustainable Ballard Fest. And they have music, they've got food, all kinds of things to attract the neighbors. And then there's a series of booths you can go to learn what you can do to reduce your carbon footprint. And the first booth you go to is the End Driver's License Station, where you go and you check all the ways you will not drive over the next month. And when you do, you get a laminated driver's license. It's pretty cool. It's just like my official Washington State driver's license. And when you get your driver's license, it entitles you to drive the shuttle bus. And this is kind of a Fred Flintstone type mobile. It's pedaled by feet. It's going down the streets of Ballard, gets everybody's attention, gets people thinking, what could I do to get out of my car? What could I do to reduce my carbon footprint? This has created a movement. Now all the neighborhoods around Ballard have organized their own all-volunteer sustainability groups. All the suburban communities around Seattle have organized their own all-volunteer sustainability groups. We now have 66 of these organizations. And collectively, they call themselves SCALLOPs, Sustainable Communities All Over Puget Sound. And it all started with Dervilla Gowan and those street trees. There's incredible untapped potential in our communities. There's no other way we're going to address climate change. We can invent all the green technology we want, but if people don't actually adopt it, people don't start thinking themselves as community members, we've lost it. So important that we partner with community. Other examples of projects, every one of our playgrounds, both in our parks and in our schools, has been rebuilt by community volunteers. It used to be every one of our playgrounds looked exactly the same. I think our Parks Department got a really good deal. But now they reflect the unique character of the place, the needs of the people. So this is the first playground to be redeveloped. And when they did the design meeting, some of the children showed up in wheelchairs. So they built the first wheelchair accessible playground in Seattle. And we see this over and over again, that the innovations come out of the community. This is in Carkeek Park in northwest Seattle, where neighbors had worked for 20 years to clean up the creek to make it better salmon habitat. And after 20 years of work, they were finally successful. Salmon came back. They said, well, this is great. We've got salmon. Now we want to get kids back into our park. We don't have any playground. We want to build a playground. So they got matching funds. They had their design meeting. And at the design meeting, one of the young people raised his hand and said, I want a salmon playground. And the adults are scratching their heads because nobody had ever seen a salmon playground before. And a local artist said, I've got an idea. And he built a 19-foot long salmon that's so big, you slide it in the mouth and you come out the tail. And then you climb into a cave and you climb over boulders, and it gives kids a sense of the struggle that salmon go through to get back to the city of Seattle. So here's where you go in. It's pretty scary, right? And here's where you come out and you land in a foam rubber sea. This is over and over again. Community members are discovering underutilized properties. This is under our freeway in Seattle, under Interstate 5. And underneath the interstate is good for nothing except holding up the interstate. So there are all kinds of public safety problems, illegal dumping, drug dealing, all kinds of bad things going on underneath the interstate. The young people went under there and said this could be the perfect place for something we've always wanted but haven't been able to find the land for. A BMX track. So now it's just ingenious. They've got a BMX track that's always covered from the rain. We'll talk about the liability issues later. This is in our Finney neighborhood. This is a piece of land that was platted as a street. There are houses on either side, but it was never developed because it's too steep. Cars could never make it up to the top. It's just way too steep. So as a result, it just became overgrown, became a nuisance in the community, started to attract rodents. The only thing that tried to get up were four-wheel drive vehicles in the middle of the night. They'd race their engines, they'd squeal their tires, and challenge each other to see if they could make it to the top, driving the neighbors totally crazy. Well, I thought the neighbors were crazy because they applied for matching funds, and by hand, they used picks and shovels, went through that heavy hard pan clay soil, hauled these timbers up the side, terraced that whole hillside, and turned that problem property into a community garden where there's a picnic area at the top and a children's play area. And we see this over and over again, taking properties that were in the hands of a department that the property didn't work for that department and made it work for the community. This is in Mount Baker neighborhood. This is a site of a former school. And the Parks Department purchased it. It was just covered with asphalt. And the community brought the community leaders together, community members together and said, let's plan for a park. And as they planned, they decided they wanted to do a park with an urban agriculture theme. So they call it Bradner Gardens. 50,000 hours of volunteer labor have gone into this over the past 10 years. And here's what's resulted. This is the gateway into the park. Some of the views out over downtown Seattle. But what I love about this garden is that it's a garden of inclusion. Very diverse neighborhood. 40% of the gardeners are from Laos, using their traditional gardening techniques and sharing with the other neighbors. Center Park, which is low-income housing for people with disabilities, is just below the garden. So they put in raised beds so that they could participate in the garden. Lighthouse for the Blind is next door, so they built sensory and tactile gardens so that they could appreciate the gardens. There's youth gardens. There's gardens for absolutely everybody. And for those who don't like to garden, there's all kinds of gathering places and public art to bring people in. There's a low place in this garden where all the water drains. And it creates this wonderful little pond. But by the end of the summer, the water gets really stagnant and it starts attracting mosquitoes. A big problem. So one of the neighbors got online and found a windmill for sale on a farm in Iowa. They had it disassembled, shipped to Seattle. They reassembled it on site. Now it pumps water out of the pond to the other end of the park, creates a stream that flows through the park, keeps the water circulating so you don't have a problem with the mosquitoes. Not a solution that would have come out of our parks department.